Force Bill by Andrew Jackson was in 1832 to 1833, where the United States confronted a constitutional crisis over tariffs, state rights, and the limits of executive power, and Congress forced bill and Clay's compromise tariff resolved the immediate danger while deepening successional decisions that pointed towards the Civil War. What was the Force Bill? The Force Bill was passed in Congress in 1833. It gave President Andrew Jackson authority to use military and Navy force to enforce federal laws. It was caused by the response to South Carolina in an attempt to make them obey federal tariffs. It was also the first law in the U.S. authorizing military force against a state. So, the Force Bill was a way for Congress to back Jackson up in case South Carolina resisted force. And the Force Bill was Jackson's way of saying the Union must be preserved at all costs. One of the causes of the Force Bill was the Tariff of Abominations that occurred in 1828. In 1828, tariffs were the highest they've ever been in U.S. history. It benefited the Northern industries, but it was the opposite for Southern, as it had poorly affected their economy, so they deeply opposed it. Tariffs had greatly impacted the northern manufacturers because of the price that was raised. But however, southern planters found it unfair because it supposedly favored the north at the expense of south. The image will show the abominations, how it shows the growing division between the north and the south. It had created the resentment that will fuel later conflicts like the Civil War. Now, state right versus federal authority. So, state rights was the belief that states can limit or reject federal laws. For federal authority, it was the belief that the Constitution makes federal law supreme. So, John C. Calhoun was the vice president under Jackson, who had secretly written the South Carolina Exposition and Protest in 1828. He argued that because of the Constitution was a compact between the states, he believed each state had the right to judge the constitutionality of federal laws.
The nullification crisis begins. In 1832, Congress passes a slight lower in tariffs, but South still objects. South Carolina passes the Ordinance of Nullification in November 1832, declares both 1828 and 1832 tariff null and void. South Carolina, called a state convention, had officially declared that the federal tariff laws would not be enforced within the state. However, the state threatened to break away from the Union if the federal government tried to collect tariffs by force. Since then, that was the most serious threat of this union the U.S. had faced. Jackson, although Southerner and a supporter of the state, refused to tolerate disobedience to the federal law, so he was willing to use force to preserve the Union. Jackson's response. Jackson issued the proclamation to the people of South Carolina on December 11, 1832. Jackson had stated that the nullification was unconstitutional and an act of disloyalty. He had asked Congress for the authority to enforce the law, which was a result of the Force Bill. In Jackson's proclamation, Jackson directly appealed to the South citizens, stating, "The Constitution forms a government, not a league. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union is to say the United States is not a nation." Jackson's statement had made it clear that the Union was perpetual, not voluntarily. The Force Bill, 1833. The Force Bill was passed by Congress on March 1833. It was used by the military to enforce tariff collection, moved federal custom homes. The Force Bill made it legal for the president to use military power against a state that defied the federal law. It applied specifically to the revenue collection. However, it set a large precedent. The federal government would not allow states to pick and choose which laws to obey. The main thing to note is that the Force Bill expanded power, showing that Jackson used the presidency not just to enforce laws, but to define the authority of the federal government itself. South Carolina's reaction. Instead of calling it the Force Bill, South Carolina called it the Bloody Bill, declared the Force Bill null and void within the state, began military preparations in case of conflict. South Carolina saw the Force Bill as an act of tyranny, referring to Jackson as someone who is another king, George III. South Carolina began organizing militia units, but Southern states did not support the South Carolina's radical position as they wanted to avoid war. As a result, this isolation weakened South Carolina's stance and increased pressure to compromise. The Compromise Tariff of 1833. It was proposed by Henry Clay and gradually reduced tariff rates over 10 years. It was passed alongside the Force Bill. Henry Clay was an American statesman at the House of Representatives, but he is known for as a prominent political leader known for his diplomatic work called the American System. Henry Clay has stepped in to stop the crisis. His compromise tariff has slowly lowered important status, giving southern states relief, while allowing Jackson to claim his so-called victory. South Carolina had accepted the compromise and repealed its nullification ordinance. However, it symbolically nullified the force bill after repealing the tariff nullification. Although this crisis may have ended on all right terms, the issue of state rights and secession remained unsolved. Results and long-term effects. The federal government asserted its supremacy over the states. The idea of nullification and secession still continued as it later returned in 1860s. The nullification crisis was the first real test of federal authority versus state rights under the Constitution. The outcome reinforced the idea that the Constitution is supreme and the Union is invisible. However, Southerners learned that the federal government could use force against them, which led to fear and mistrust, especially as slavery became the next great conflict between the North and South. Significance. Executive power. Jackson used federal force to uphold the law. Federal supremacy. States couldn't nullify even through will. The force bill and nullification had an outcome on politics and power, as it showed how far the executive branch could go to maintain federal authority. Despite Andrew Jackson being known for as a hypocrite, his presidency had somewhat strengthened the office of president, but stood strong executive leadership.